Please step away from the ventilator. The alarm shrieked so sharply that the nurses jumped from their stations. My husband stood by my hospital bed, his hand hovering right next to the tubing that, a split second earlier, had stopped functioning properly. I lay completely still. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't scream. I couldn't tell the people rushing around me that I could still hear them. "It was an accident," Mark blurted out. My sleeve caught on it. The young nursing student looked at him, then down at me. "Helen, if you can hear me, please move one finger." The entire room seemed to freeze. I moved it. Mark went pale. "One more time," the young woman whispered. I moved my finger again. This time, Chloe took a step back. She stepped back because just a few days earlier, my husband had asked our life insurance agent what documents would be needed upon my death, and I was insured for a payout that could wipe away every single one of his secret debts. Mark thought I would never be able to tell anyone what had happened. Do you want to know how we got here? 9 months earlier, I wouldn't have believed anyone who told me this. If someone had said I would one day be terrified of the man I had shared 18 years of my life with, I would have thought they were insane. We lived in Detroit, Michigan, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of an older building in Midtown, where the stairwell smelled of damp wool coats in the winter and baked concrete in the summer. There was nothing spectacularly dramatic about our lives. In the mornings, I drank dark roast coffee at the kitchen table. Mark usually left a few minutes past 7 to open up his auto repair shop. I drove to a mid-size auto parts manufacturer where, for 13 years, I had handled payroll, employee records, and all the tedious paperwork nobody ever notices until a single digit is off by 10 cents. I was 47 years old. I liked order, but I wasn't an obsessive perfectionist. I liked knowing how much we had in our checking account, but I didn't consider money to be the most important thing in a marriage. Years later, I realized that this second belief became a very convenient excuse for me not to ask a few crucial questions when I really should have. Mark wasn't always the man Chloe saw standing by my hospital bed. When we first met, he was still working at someone else's garage. He would come home exhausted, the scent of motor oil and metal practically baked into his skin, but he would still drive across town with me past midnight if I left important paperwork at my mother's house. When I caught a terrible flu, he spent 3 days making chicken noodle soup from my aunt's recipe, pretending every single time that adding a pinch of rosemary was his own culinary stroke of genius. When my father passed away and I couldn't sleep, he would just sit next to me on the sofa in the dark, saying nothing. He was simply there. That is exactly what people don't understand when they ask later, how could you not have seen it? You see 1,000 other things first, good things. And those good things build a thick curtain. After 12 years of working for other people, Mark opened his own shop. It wasn't huge. 3 hydraulic lifts, a cramped front office, 2 mechanics, and a back lot that always held more cars than common sense should allow. For the first few years, he did great. He had word-of-mouth clients, a solid maintenance contract with a local courier company, and another deal servicing a fleet of sales vehicles. He was proud. So was I. When he took out a business lease for a brand new lift, I only said, "If you've run the numbers, I trust you." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "That's why I have a wife who understands math." I never imagined that a few years later, numbers would become the very first thing he would refuse to show me. The first red flag appeared in late November. I came home from work early because the company's payroll server crashed, and there was no point sitting in my cubicle until 5. I grabbed the mail from the lobby box. A DTE energy bill for electricity, an Xfinity internet flyer, and a heavy envelope from Chase Bank addressed to Mark's business but sent to our home. I left everything on the kitchen table. When Mark walked in, he took off his jacket, saw the envelope, and stopped so abruptly it was as if he had hit an invisible wall. "Something came from the bank," I said. "I see it." He snatched the envelope much faster than I expected. "Are you forwarding business mail to the apartment?" "The system just auto-filled it," he muttered. He ripped the envelope open, read the first 2 lines, and immediately folded the paper in half. "Is something wrong?" I asked. Mark sighed loudly. "Helen, please. I've been running this shop for 12 years. I really don't need my own wife auditing me." I was completely caught off guard by his tone. "I'm not auditing you. I'm just asking. You question every little thing. That wasn't true. He knew it. I knew it. But when someone speaks to you with the exhausted tone of a man suffering a great injustice, it becomes dangerously easy to stop demanding answers and start looking for the fault within yourself. Fine, I said, if it's nothing important. He vanished into the bathroom. I stood alone in the kitchen. The kettle had just finished boiling. Steam clung to the window glass, and the muffled hum of Woodward Avenue traffic drifted up from below. I stared at the closed bathroom door and, for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel anger. I felt a tiny, sharp prick of anxiety. Because right before Mark had turned away from the table, I noticed his hand. It was trembling. A few weeks later, little things started to vanish. Not cash from my wallet, not jewelry. It wasn't anything that simple. What vanished was transparency. Mark started checking the mail before I got home. He switched a bulk of his invoices to paperless delivery. When I asked about the equipment lease, he answered in single, clipped sentences. When I asked about a client whose cars had been sitting in his lot untouched for months, he vaguely claimed they were negotiating. And one evening, when I gently suggested that I could sit down with his expense reports and see if we could streamline anything, he put his fork down hard on his plate. Do you want to run my garage? No. So why won't you let me do the one thing I actually do for a living? Because we are married. That doesn't mean we have to hold hands and look at every single receipt together. If those receipts can impact our mortgage or our joint checking account, it actually means exactly that. He stared at me across the dining table. His face wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was completely closed off. That was much worse. The next day, he stopped at my favorite bakery and brought home pastries. He set the paper bag next to the coffee maker. I crossed a line yesterday, he said. He didn't outright apologize. I didn't push it. We ate breakfast, watched a show on Netflix that evening, and for a few days, everything felt normal again. Back then, I thought normal meant the absence of arguments. Today, I know that sometimes, normal is just the dead silence between two warning sirens. In early January, we sat down with our bank advisor to review the mortgage on our apartment. We still had a few years left to pay off. Mark suggested we organize our financial safety nets and take out life insurance policies. You know how it is, he said on the drive home. If something happens to either of us, the other won't be left drowning in a mortgage alone. It sounded entirely responsible. He didn't pressure me aggressively. He didn't shove papers in my face yelling at me to sign. I read the terms. I asked the broker questions. I knew exactly what the payout sum was. I knew Mark was listed as the primary beneficiary in the event of my death. He had a policy, too, naming me. There was something deeply mundane and adult about the whole process. That is exactly why it took me so incredibly long to accept that this standard piece of paper had morphed into something sinister in his mind. He didn't plan it from the beginning. I am absolutely certain of that. I don't believe in movies where a normal guy wakes up on a Tuesday as a calculating monster. What terrifies me far more is the reality that a human being can push their moral boundaries millimeter by millimeter, until one day they look around and realize they are standing in a place they would have previously sworn they would never visit. Mark was changing exactly like that. Slowly, almost rationally, and I, still completely unaware of how catastrophic the situation at his shop actually was, kept confusing his toxic shame with wounded ambition. By February, I noticed Mark was coming home much later, but not because the shop was booming. I could always tell the difference. When the garage was packed with paying jobs, he walked through the door physically exhausted and annoyed by loud noises. Now, he came home buzzing with a frantic, nervous energy, like a man who had spent hours trying to sell a lie he didn't even believe himself anymore. He started taking his cell phone into the shower with him. I didn't suspect an affair. I recognized that specific brand of tension from my own line of work. It was the desperate tension of people trying to push back a deadline, explain away a missed payment, and beg for just one more week. One night, Mark fell asleep on the living room sofa. His phone screen lit up on the coffee table. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even know his passcode, but I didn't need to. One single sentence flashed across the locked screen. Final notice of default. Payment required immediately. Right below it was a number. I didn't see the full text message, but I saw the figure, $42,780. A hot rush of adrenaline hit my chest. Mark's eyes snapped open almost instantly. He looked at the glowing screen, then up at me. "What is that?" I asked, sitting up straight. "Business stuff." $42,000 is just business stuff? Mark, do not look at my phone. I wasn't snooping. It lit up right in front of me. He snatched the phone and hit the power button to black out the screen. "Don't start." I remembered those two words better than the massive dollar amount. Don't start. As if a conversation about our family's financial survival was just me nagging him. "Mark, if you are in trouble, you have to tell me." "I am not in trouble. I literally just saw a final notice for default. Every single business on earth has accounts payable and receivable, Helen. Are you over $40,000 in the hole to someone?" He stood up abruptly. "I am not going to be interrogated in my own living room." "This isn't an interrogation. You're my husband. To you, everything is just a spreadsheet. Column A, column B. It either balances or it doesn't. A real business doesn't operate like that. Debt operates exactly like that. It either exists or it doesn't." He stopped at the door. For a fraction of a second, I thought he was going to break down and tell me. Instead, he walked out. He didn't come back until after midnight. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep, but I heard him standing in the dark kitchen for a long time. The clink of a glass on the granite counter. The faucet running. The heavy silence. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. That was his new survival tactic. First, aggressively shut down the conversation, then wait for time to smooth over the awkwardness. At work, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't confide in my friends. I didn't want to paint Mark as an irresponsible failure based on a single locked screen notification. More than that, I was profoundly embarrassed. My entire career was built on managing other people's money. I audited corrections, verified tax withholdings, and ensured over 200 factory workers got their exact checks on time every Friday. Yet, I had absolutely no idea what my own husband's liabilities were. One afternoon, I was having lunch in the break room with Rachel from the accounting department. We were talking about something totally unrelated. Her brother was going through a messy divorce after 30 years of marriage, and it was only during the legal discovery phase that the wife found out about two massive secret credit cards. Rachel shook her head, swirling her fork in her salad. People always confuse blind trust with willful ignorance. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If you trust someone, you give them space. But being married doesn't mean you get a free pass to ignore what your partner is doing financially. Legally, you're on the hook. Then it all blows up and everyone cries, but he always handled the bills. It's crazy." I didn't say a word back to her. But that sentence echoed in my head all the way home. I decided I wasn't going to dig through Mark's physical briefcases. I wasn't going to cross a boundary just because he built a wall. But I did log into our joint Chase checking account. I had every legal and moral right to do so. The balance was drastically lower than it should have been. I pulled up the transaction history. Over the span of 6 weeks, Mark had initiated several wire transfers from our joint family account over to his LLC's business account. They weren't massive all at once, which is why I missed them. $3,200, $4,850, $2,600, then one bigger hit of $7,000. Altogether, over $20,000 of our savings was gone. Not a single word had been spoken to me about it. When he walked in that evening, the printed bank statement was sitting right in the middle of the kitchen table. He looked at it, and his shoulders instantly locked up. "So you're tracking my moves now?" "I am checking the bank account, where my direct deposit goes every 2 weeks," I fired back. "I had to pay my parts suppliers to keep the doors open." "Why didn't you say a single word to me?" "Because I knew you would do exactly this. You panic." I let out a short, harsh laugh. There was zero humor in it. "This isn't panic. This is $20,000 of our money. Our money, Mark. Meaning half of it is mine. Joint does not mean available for you to take secretly." He slammed his hand down on the back of a dining chair, not aiming at me, but the loud crack of flesh on wood was enough to make me stop talking. He went quiet, too. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the apartment was the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he pulled the chair out and sat heavily. I will put it back. From what jobs? You just told me you have client issues. You have final notices on your phone. You are draining our savings. Tell me right now, exactly how much do you owe? He looked up at me. His eyes were cold. You do not need to know everything. That sentence hurt worse than if he had screamed at me. I am your wife. Exactly. My wife, not my business partner. That was the exact moment I realized this was no longer just about unpaid invoices. This was about the incredibly small box Mark had assigned me to live inside. I was expected to share the devastating consequences, but I was strictly forbidden from having a seat at the table to make the decisions. 2 days later, he actually used the word sorry. He sat me down. I am sorry. It is worse than I made it sound, but I am going to pull us out of this. He showed me a stack of paperwork. The lease default. A massive debt to a major auto parts distributor. A lost fleet contract. He didn't show me everything. I didn't know that at the time. Sell off some of the heavy equipment if you have to, I told him. Cut your overhead. Talk to a CPA about restructuring. Do not dump another dime of our personal money into a sinking ship without a verified plan. I have a plan, he promised. A massive new corporate contract. He named a well-known logistics company in Detroit. He swore the ink was practically drying on the deal. I wanted to believe him, not because I was hopelessly naive, but because, after 18 years, a human brain simply cannot recategorize a husband from life partner to active threat overnight. For the next month, Mark seemed calmer. He stopped bleeding our joint account dry, at least visibly. He started coming home at a decent hour. One Sunday, we even drove over to Belle Isle Park. It was bitterly cold, the walking paths slick with melting snow. We bought hot coffees in paper cups and walked for an hour, talking about 100 things that had nothing to do with the garage. At one point, he grabbed my hand. "We are going to be okay," he said. I looked at him, desperately wanting that sentence to be the truth. Not long after that Sunday, I started coughing. It started as a dry tickle, then evolved into something heavy and constant. I assumed it was a seasonal bug. Half my office had been out sick. I bought over-the-counter syrup, took 2 sick days, and promised myself I'd go to urgent care if it didn't clear up. It didn't clear up. On the 4th night, I woke up at 3 a.m. and realized I physically could not pull a full breath into my lungs. Mark clicked on the bedside lamp. "Helen?" I sat up. The air was catching shallowly in my chest, as if my windpipe had been cemented shut just below my throat. "I can't," I wheezed. Mark didn't argue. 10 minutes later, we were speeding down Woodward Avenue toward the emergency room. Even then, sitting in the passenger seat clutching my chest, struggling to stay conscious, I felt safe simply because he was the one driving. At the hospital, everything moved faster than my brain could process. First an oxygen mask, then aggressive blood draws. Portable chest x-rays wheeled into the bay. Rapid-fire questions from doctors that I answered with shorter and shorter words because every syllable cost me precious oxygen. I remember the face of the attending physician leaning over me. I remember the cold bite of the plastic mask digging into my nose. I remember Mark standing a few yards away by the curtain, holding my purse in his hands. "You're going to be okay," he told me. I wanted to believe him. Over the next few hours, despite the heavy IV antibiotics, I crashed. I was admitted, then rapidly transferred to the intensive care unit. Through the haze, I heard medical jargon floating above my head. Severe bilateral pneumonia, acute respiratory distress, blood oxygen levels failing to stabilize. I don't remember the exact moment the doctor told Mark they had to intubate me and put me on a mechanical ventilator. I only remember fractured shards of time, a gloved hand pressing on my shoulder, a calm voice saying, "Try not to panic, Helen. We're going to put you to sleep to help your lungs rest." The blinding fluorescent lights overhead. Then, a dark, heavy void that felt absolutely nothing like sleep. Mark later told everyone that on the first day, he sat in the ICU waiting room for 6 straight hours. He called my office and left a message with Rachel, telling her to inform payroll that I wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. He drove home and packed a bag of toiletries the nurses suggested. He signed all the necessary consent forms as my next of kin. He wasn't pretending to be a terrified, devoted husband on day one. He actually was one. At least, that is what I choose to believe to keep my sanity. Chloe saw him for the first time on my second day in the ICU. She was 24, completing her final clinical rotations for nursing school. She wasn't making independent medical decisions. She was strictly under the supervision of the charge nurses. She usually stood half a step behind the veterans. She observed, she asked clinical questions, and she took meticulous notes. Mark caught her attention not because he was acting like a villain. On the contrary, he was painfully polite, quiet, unobtrusive. He asked the nurses if he could bring in my specific brand of hand lotion because he knew how much I hated dry skin. He asked if it was okay to talk to me while I was medically paralyzed and sedated. One of the senior nurses smiled warmly at him. Absolutely. Even if a patient doesn't physically respond, we assume they can hear us. We always talk to them normally. That one piece of advice would later return in the most horrifying context imaginable. For the first few days, my prognosis was grim. The doctors made zero promises. Mark was given extremely cautious updates. The bacterial infection was brutal. My body was absorbing the antibiotics, but at a painfully slow rate. Any minor improvement could instantly reverse into organ failure. And right during those critical days, out in the real world, Mark's house of cards violently collapsed. I learned the timeline of this much later. On the exact day the doctors shoved a breathing tube down my throat, a major parts supplier filed a formal lawsuit against Mark's business. 2 days after that, the commercial leasing company sent a final intent to repossess his heavy equipment. That miraculous corporate contract he promised was going to save us? It went to a competitor. Mark didn't just have one secret debt. He had half a dozen, bleeding between his business LLC and personal lines of credit. And without his ability to quietly drain my paychecks from the Chase account to stop the bleeding, the walls were crushing him. While I lay completely unconscious, there was no one left for him to lie to. On my third day on the ventilator, Mark received a phone call from a private creditor demanding immediate payment. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. I don't know the exact threats that were made. I only know that immediately after hanging up with the creditor, Mark dialed the 1-800 number for our life insurance provider. This call wasn't unearthed by some cinematic FBI wiretap. It was retrieved as a standard, legally recorded customer service log. Date, time, policy number, and the agent's summary of the inquiry. Insurance call centers document every single interaction. On the recorded line, Mark said, "I just need to know what the standard procedure is and what documents are required in the event of the insured person's passing." He asked about claim forms. He asked about death certificates. He asked how fast the payout is wired to the beneficiary's account once the paperwork is approved. Legally, he committed no crime on that phone call. A terrified spouse of a critically ill patient might naturally panic and try to understand the financial logistics of a looming tragedy. If the story ended there, the phone call would be nothing more than a dark, sad footnote. But the story didn't end there. On the 5th day, my attending physician gave Mark the very first spark of genuinely good news. My blood oxygen levels were holding steady without maximum machine support. The aggressive antibiotics had broken the fever. "If this positive trend holds through the night," the doctor explained in the hallway, "our team is going to slowly begin dialing back the sedation drips tomorrow. We want to evaluate her neurological baseline and see if she can initiate breaths on her own." Mark listened. "So, she might wake up?" "She is still critically ill," the doctor cautioned. "But yes, we are going to assess her responsiveness and start waking her up if her lungs handle the transition." Chloe, the nursing student, was standing at the charting station 15 feet away. She wasn't actively eavesdropping, but the ICU is a quiet place. She heard the tail end of the conversation. She remembered it vividly because Mark's reaction was entirely wrong. He didn't collapse against the wall in relief. He didn't say, "Thank God." He didn't ask how soon he could talk to me. He stared blankly at the polished linoleum floor for several agonizing seconds. Then he looked back up at the doctor and asked, "And if she takes a turn for the worse, and she passes away, who exactly at the hospital issues the death certificate for the family?" The doctor looked slightly taken aback but answered professionally, assuring him the hospital handles the required legal paperwork, but reiterated they were focusing entirely on my recovery. When Chloe told me this later, she said, "At the time, I just told myself grief makes people act weird. I didn't want to judge him." That detail is vital. This entire nightmare wasn't exposed because a 24-year-old student had a psychic premonition of evil. It was exposed because when she finally witnessed an undeniable physical act, she separated undeniable facts from emotional assumptions. After that doctor's update, Mark's obsession with administrative details escalated. He peppered the nursing staff with odd questions. Does the family automatically get a copy of the medical chart? Is the medical examiner called for ICU deaths? How fast does the morgue release a body? None of these questions were illegal. They were just deeply, fundamentally incompatible with the reality that my condition was improving. One of the veteran nurses even muttered to a colleague by the medication fridge, "It's like the guy is trying to plan the funeral catering while we're actively taking her off life support." Nobody reported him to the police, because being a pessimist isn't a felony. Meanwhile, back at our apartment, another autopay bounced on our Chase account. This time, it was our mortgage payment. My older sister Sarah, who held a limited power of attorney from when we managed our mother's estate, had stepped in to help keep my side of the bills afloat while I was hospitalized. She noticed the massive negative balance. Sarah called Mark's cell phone. "What is going on with the Chase account?" The mortgage bounced. "I'll handle it," Mark snapped. "The grace period is over, Mark. I'm just asking if you need help covering it this month because Helen is." I said I will handle it. "My wife is dying in a hospital bed. I don't need you harassing me about a bank error." He hung up on her. That same evening, he received another final legal warning from his commercial landlord. The next morning, Mark arrived at the ICU earlier than usual. In the pocket of his jacket was a phone displaying a digital mountain of debt that was about to bury him alive. In his head was another number, the exact payout of my life insurance policy. I will never know the precise second he decided that my surviving this illness was his ultimate worst-case scenario. Maybe it was when the doctor said they were reducing my sedation. Maybe the seed was planted during that call with the insurance agent. Maybe it was a fleeting, desperate, intrusive thought that he simply allowed to take root. I will never know, and honestly, that is the most terrifying part of all, because the journey from an awful thought to an evil action is rarely one giant leap. It is paved with 1,000 tiny, cowardly justifications. She's going to die anyway. She's suffering. The bankruptcy will destroy us both. If a machine malfunctions, it's just an act of God. Nobody will ever know. That morning, Mark stood outside the heavy double doors of the ICU for a long time. He made one final phone call to the man he owed money to. The conversation ended with Mark abruptly hanging up. He shoved the phone in his pocket, swiped his visitor pass, and walked to my bay. I was still lying motionless. My eyes were taped shut to prevent corneal scratching, but the heavy sedation drips had been reduced by half overnight. Deep down, beneath the chemical fog, my brain was fighting its way toward the surface. I don't remember the sterile lights of the ICU. I don't remember Mark's face hovering over me. I don't even remember the shrill wail of the alarms in the way a normal person remembers a sound. What remains in my memory is more like a terrifying sleep paralysis, a suffocating pressure, a chaotic vibration in the room, and the frantic feeling that I was trapped screaming behind a wall of thick, unbreakable glass. But Chloe remembered every single detail. She was charting vitals under the supervision of a senior nurse who had momentarily stepped into the adjacent patient bay. For about 30 seconds, the immediate space around my bed was relatively quiet. It wasn't negligence. It was just the standard ebb and flow of a busy American hospital. Mark stood directly beside my bed. Families of patients on life support are given explicit, terrifyingly clear instructions. Do not touch the ventilator tubes. Do not bump the IV poles. Do not touch the monitor cables. When the critical airway alarm shrieked, Chloe whipped her head around. She saw Mark standing intimately close to the complicated array of corrugated plastic tubing connected to my throat. She saw his right hand rapidly jerking back away from the exact coupling that was absolutely strictly forbidden to touch. She saw instantly that the primary circuit delivering oxygen to my lungs had been physically disconnected. Chloe didn't freeze. She didn't try to play hero and fix the complex respiratory equipment herself. She shouted for the charge nurse at the top of her lungs. "Please step away from the ventilator right now." Mark stumbled a step backward. He threw his hands up defensively. "It was an accident. My jacket sleeve caught on the plastic." A swarm of blue scrubs descended on my bed. The alarm didn't ring for long. This wasn't a television drama where everyone stares in horror while the monitor flatlines. The fail-safes worked exactly as engineered. The machine detected the sudden loss of airway pressure, screamed for help, and the medical professionals reconnected the circuit in seconds. They pumped my lungs with manual oxygen and stabilized my crashing vitals. But while the chaos resolved, Chloe's eyes locked onto Mark. She realized something chilling. When the life support alarm went off, Mark hadn't screamed for a doctor. He hadn't hit the emergency call button on the bed rail. He hadn't run into the hallway begging for help. He had just stood there in silence, watching the monitor flash red. If a loving husband truly snagged a life support tube by accident, his first explosive instinct would be sheer panic to save his wife. Mark did absolutely nothing until Chloe caught him. Once the respiratory therapist secured my airway, Chloe looked up at the monitors, then down at my face. She knew the attending physician had slashed my sedation doses overnight. She remembered her training. Always assume the patient is in there. She stepped past Mark, leaned down to my ear, and spoke clearly. "Helen, if you can hear me, please move one finger." I have no concept of how long the silence lasted in that room. To me, trapped in the dark, it could have been a millisecond or a decade. There are no visuals in my memory. Just an overwhelming, gravitational pull toward a voice that was demanding I prove I existed. My index finger twitched against the bedsheet. Chloe let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "One more time, Helen. Please." I moved it again. A deliberate, undeniable slide across the cotton fabric. It was logged in the chart exactly that way. Mark went ghostly pale. Chloe went pale too, but not because she had instantly unraveled a massive financial murder plot. She knew nothing about Chase Bank, or the auto parts lawsuit, or the phone call to the insurance broker. She only knew that she had just witnessed something profoundly unnatural, and it had to be documented immediately. The charge nurse turned to Mark, her voice ironclad. "Sir, I need you to step out into the hallway immediately." "I am her husband," he protested, his voice cracking. "I understand that, but you need to leave the clinical area right now." "I didn't do anything." Nobody had accused him of doing anything yet. He was the first person to introduce the concept of guilt into the room. "Nobody said you did," the nurse replied coldly. "Step outside." Mark glared at Chloe. "She is just a student, right?" Chloe's back stiffened. "I am a clinical intern." "Then maybe tell the intern not to invent a massive conspiracy over a clumsy mistake," he sneered. The charge nurse physically stepped between them. "Do not address my staff. We will review the telemetry data and the incident report. Wait in the family room." Mark's jaw clenched so tight I imagine his teeth ached. He stormed out. Chloe stayed. And one of the very first things she did was open the electronic medical record and document exactly what she witnessed. Time of day. Exact location of the alarm. Mark's physical proximity to the disconnected circuit, his lack of a call for help, his exact verbal excuse, and my neurological response to her command. She didn't write. The husband tried to murder her. She didn't write. He is a sociopath. She wrote the clinical, indisputable facts. That sterile, emotionless professionalism is exactly what cemented the credibility of the entire criminal case later on. A few hours later, the ICU director and risk management initiated an internal review. They pulled the ventilator logs. It takes a specific amount of mechanical force to disconnect that specific valve. It does not simply brush off on a passing cotton sleeve. Mark was officially informed by hospital security that his visitation privileges were heavily restricted. If he was allowed back in, he would be escorted by a staff member and was forbidden from approaching the left side of the bed. That was when Mark changed his story for the very first time. Meeting with the hospital liaison, He abandoned the sleeve defense. He claimed that he had actually noticed the tubing looking slightly crooked, and he was merely trying to push it back together to help. Mr. Miller, the liaison said, "You were given explicit instructions upon admission that families are never to touch the respiratory equipment." "I wasn't tampering with it," Mark backpedaled. "You just stated you were trying to push it back together." Mark rubbed his face. "I misspoke. I was exhausted." Chloe was in the room as a witness. She said nothing. It was the first crack in the dam, not a confession, a crack. When a man is telling the truth, his memory doesn't require constant revisions. That evening, the hospital's patient advocate called my sister Sarah. They did not feed her sensationalized theories. They simply informed her that there had been a severe patient safety incident involving Mark at the bedside, the ventilator had been compromised, and hospital security had restricted his access pending an investigation. Sarah drove to the hospital the next morning. Mark was pacing the lobby, looking frantic and furious. "That idiot student made up a whole story," he hissed the second he saw her. "What student?" "The intern." She panicked over nothing. What exactly did she see, Mark? "Nothing. That's the whole point. Nothing happened." "Then why did the hospital file a formal security incident and ban you from the room?" "Because it's a corporate hospital, Sarah. They're terrified of malpractice lawsuits, so they document every shadow." Sarah looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "What did you do?" "Nothing!" Mark shouted, drawing stairs from the reception desk. "She is my wife." "I know exactly who she is," Sarah replied. Sarah later told me that was the exact moment the icy dread settled in her stomach. She didn't scream at him. She didn't cause a scene in the lobby. She walked to her car, locked the doors, called a family friend who worked as an attorney in Oakland County, and asked one simple question: "How do I legally freeze my incapacitated sister's financial assets by the end of the day?" It was the first strategic move made purely out of survival, without theatrical threats or dramatic confrontations. Meanwhile, inside the ICU, I was slowly, agonizingly being pulled back into the world. It was nothing like waking up in a movie. I didn't flutter my eyelashes and ask what year it was. First came the sensory overload. The beeping, the blinding glare of the ceiling tiles, the crushing weight of my own limbs. Then came a deep, primal terror that I couldn't articulate. I heard voices, but the English language sounded like underwater static. Sometimes I hallucinated figures standing in the corner. Sometimes I drifted away before I could figure out if they were real. When I finally managed to keep my eyes open and track movement, a nurse leaned over me. "You're okay, Helen?" she said gently. "You're at Detroit Receiving Hospital. You are safe now." Safe. That word should have washed over me like a warm blanket. Instead, the heart monitor next to my bed immediately began to beep faster. I didn't have my memories back yet, but my nervous system remembered exactly what had happened. Mark wasn't allowed into the room until days later, and only after the doctors determined I was fully lucid and a security guard was posted in the hallway. He walked in, holding a pathetic bouquet of yellow tulips from the gift shop. He looked like a man walking to the electric chair. He stepped to the designated line taped on the floor. "Helen." His eyes were bloodshot. There were real tears spilling down his cheeks. That was the most sickening part of all. A human being is fully capable of committing an atrocity and still crying over it. He was mourning the memory of the woman he loved, even as he tried to murder the physical version of her to pay off his debts. He reached his hand out toward the bed rail. Without thinking, my brain bypassed logic and went straight to survival instinct. I violently yanked my arm back toward my chest. Mark stopped. His hand hovered in the empty air. I looked at his face, and for the very first time in 18 years, I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't excuse, explain away, or call love. Recovering my mind was a brutal, ugly process. My muscles had atrophied. Holding a plastic cup of ice chips felt like deadlifting a cinder block. My throat was raw from the plastic tube. But the absolute worst part was the jigsaw puzzle of my memory. It didn't return in a neat, linear movie. It came in violent flashes. A woman's voice shouting, the shrieking alarm, a hand pulling away, the suffocating darkness. When my vocal cords healed enough to push out a hoarse whisper, I asked my primary daytime nurse what had happened. She looked at me carefully. You had a severe desaturation event a few days ago. Your husband was at the bedside. The details will be explained by the patient advocate and the police detectives when you are medically cleared. What did he do? I rasped. I cannot discuss the clinical specifics of the investigation, Helen. I'm sorry. She didn't say, your husband tried to execute you. She stuck to the protocol, and somehow that terrifying clinical neutrality made it so much more real. It meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a crime scene. 2 days later, I asked to speak with Chloe. She came into my room during her break. She didn't strut in like a triumphant hero. She looked incredibly stressed. She sat in the vinyl chair by the window and nervously picked at her hospital ID badge. I only want to tell you the facts that I observed. She started cautiously. Please, I whispered. When the ventilator alarm triggered, your husband was standing directly over the main circuit. He pulled his hand back. He initially claimed his jacket snagged it. Later, he told administration he was trying to fix a loose connection. I closed my eyes. The puzzle pieces in my head snapped together with a sickening crunch. Did he hit the call button? I asked. Chloe paused. She looked at her hands. No, ma'am. He did not. One single word. No. And it sliced my heart perfectly in half. If Mark had accidentally knocked out the very machine keeping his wife alive, why wouldn't he scream for a doctor? Why wouldn't he smash the emergency button? Why was his absolute first instinct to silently watch the numbers drop and his second instinct to invent an alibi? There's something else, Chloe said softly. After they stabilized you, I asked you to move your finger if you could hear me. You did it twice. They documented it as a purposeful neurological response. I looked down at my pale, trembling right hand. It looked like it belonged to a corpse. I moved it? Yes. I just remember someone begging me in the dark. I felt like if I didn't answer, I was going to disappear. Chloe wiped a quick tear from her eye, instantly regaining her composure. I am incredibly glad you answered, Helen. Mark was allowed a heavily supervised visit that afternoon. He pulled up a chair and instantly launched into a frantic, breathless monologue. They are blowing this massively out of proportion, Helen. You know how these corporate hospitals are. The legal department is terrified. That young intern completely panicked, and now they're trying to cover their own tracks by blaming me. I just saw the tube looked bent, and I reached out to— You said your sleeve caught it, I interrupted. My voice was weak, but it was steady. He stopped. Well, yes. First my sleeve brushed it, and then I noticed it was loose. Chloe told me you never called for help. She is a liar, he spat. She's a 20-something kid trying to play hero for her professors. I stared at him. The sheer hatred in his voice when he spoke about the girl who saved me was entirely foreign to the man I thought I married. Mark, how do you even know what her internal report says? He blinked rapidly. What? You just said she's lying. How do you know what her official statement is if the hospital hasn't released it to you? His face flushed dark red. Do I seriously have to sit here and be cross-examined by you? After everything? I sat in that waiting room day and night while you were dying, and you look at me like I'm a convicted felon. It stung. Not because he was right, but because it is an incredibly effective manipulation tactic to deflect a direct accusation by screaming about how wounded you are. I didn't call you a felon, I said quietly. But the fact that you jumped to that word speaks volumes. He stood up, kicking the chair back. You know what? We will talk when you aren't pumped full of drugs. He walked out. He didn't try to kiss my forehead. And for the very first time in my adult life, watching him walk away didn't bring me anxiety. It brought me absolute, crystal clear relief. The next morning, Sarah brought her iPad to the hospital. I didn't want to log into my email. I didn't want to check my text messages from Mark. I logged directly into the Chase Bank app. The balance made me physically nauseous. I pulled up the 60-day history. There were the standard debits: DTE, Comcast, groceries. And then there were the massive wire transfers to his LLC. Some of them had been initiated after I was admitted to the ER. While I was lying in a medically induced coma, my husband was logging into our app and draining our emergency fund to pay his commercial suppliers. Did you know about this? I asked Sarah, turning the screen toward her. I didn't see the business transfers, she admitted gently. I only knew the mortgage bounced. Mark told me to back off. I closed my eyes and let my head sink into the pillow. I felt like I was suffocating all over again. Not because we were going to lose the Midtown apartment tomorrow, foreclosure takes time, but because Mark had stripped away my agency. He was spending my survival money while I was literally fighting to survive. I need an attorney, I told Sarah. Someone ruthless. Sarah nodded. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" Or, "Let's just wait until you're home." She pulled a business card out of her purse. The lawyer we retained was a bulldog from Bloomfield Hills. He didn't promise me a movie ending where Mark went to prison forever and I walked away a millionaire. He operated purely on brutal facts. He started by aggressively pulling the paperwork on every single debt tied to my social security number versus Mark's business tax ID. As we went through the piles of paper on my hospital tray table, the shame threatened to drown me. "I don't know," I kept saying. "I have no idea if my name is on that lease. I don't know." The lawyer looked at me over his reading glasses. "Helen, trust in a marriage does not legally exempt you from financial liability. We are going to fix this. Not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation." For the first time in months, the shame vanished, replaced by a pure, white-hot fury. I wasn't mad at myself anymore. I was furious at the system Mark and I had built together, where his favorite phrase, "Don't worry, I'll handle it," had morphed from a shield of protection into a prison cell. A few days later, the real bombshell dropped. Because the hospital incident involved suspected tampering with life support, the Detroit Police Department had opened a preliminary inquiry. During their background check into Mark's motives, they subpoenaed our financial records and flagged the phone logs. My lawyer sat by my bed and read from the detective's summary. "3 days before the ventilator incident, your husband spent 14 minutes on a recorded line with your life insurance provider." The room went completely dead silent. I looked at the attorney. What did he ask them? He asked for the exact protocol, required forms, and payout timeline in the event of your death. My blood turned to ice water. Does that phone call prove he tried to kill me? In a vacuum? No, the lawyer said, tapping his pen on the folder. A defense attorney would argue he was just a grieving husband preparing for the inevitable. But when you place that phone call on a timeline right next to a secretly bankrupt business, a doctor telling him you might wake up, and an intern catching his hand on a disconnected breathing tube, it stops being a sad coincidence. It becomes a motive. From that second forward, I stopped waiting for Mark to give me an explanation that would make it all make sense. I stopped looking for the magical puzzle piece that would prove he was innocent. Every excuse he had given made sense individually. But for him to be innocent, every single excuse had to be true at the exact same time. And the more facts that surfaced, the less room there was for accidents. My physical rehabilitation was agonizing. It started with sitting up unassisted, then walking to the bathroom, then shuffling down the hospital corridor pushing my IV pole. When I was finally discharged, I didn't go back to the Midtown apartment. I moved into Sarah's guest room in Royal Oak. Mark blew up my phone for weeks. First begging, then demanding, then threatening. "We need to talk," he left in a voicemail. "We can talk in a deposition," I texted back. "Are you insane? You're throwing away our entire marriage over a hospital misunderstanding." "I didn't try to pull the plug on our marriage, Mark. I was there every single day. I sat in that chair and cried over you." I typed my final response before blocking his number. "I know. And when the alarm went off, you just stood there and watched." The legal machinery ground forward. The police gathered statements, the hospital turned over the telemetry data, and the financial investigators audited his ruined garage. I heard terms like attempted manslaughter and reckless endangerment thrown around by prosecutors, but I forced myself to detach from the criminal outcome. I couldn't control what a jury might do 2 years from now. I could only control my own life today. For years, Mark had shut down my questions by saying, "I'll handle it." Now, I read every single legal document twice. I asked the attorneys to explain the clauses I didn't understand. I refused to sign my name on anything until I was completely satisfied. My lungs healed slowly. First, I could walk for 5 minutes, then 20. I started going to the grocery store alone. The first time I visited my own apartment to pack my things, the elevator was working, but I chose to walk up the 5 flights of stairs. I stopped twice to catch my breath, but I made it to the top, alone. Mark's auto shop didn't vanish in a cinematic FBI raid. It died a slow, miserable, bureaucratic death. The creditors seized the equipment. The landlord locked the doors. The legal fees for his defense attorneys bled him completely dry. My life insurance policy, the $250,000 lifeline he thought would save him, remained locked entirely out of his reach, because I was still breathing. When I finalized the divorce paperwork, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't pop champagne. I felt a profound, quiet exhaustion, mixed with the surreal peace of knowing that no one was ever going to put a price tag on my head again. Mark begged for one final meeting through his lawyers before the civil asset division was finalized. I agreed, on the strict condition that it happened in a crowded public place. We met at a busy coffee shop in downtown Royal Oak. I sat in a booth by the front window. When he walked in, he looked 10 years older. The swagger was gone. He slid into the booth across from me. He stared at his hands holding a paper cup. "You look healthy," he said quietly. "I am. I don't understand how it all fell apart like this." Years ago, that broken tone would have triggered my instinct to reach across the table and comfort him. Now, I just heard a coward refusing to take accountability. "You know exactly how, Mark." He flinched. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "What wasn't?" He looked up, his eyes glassy. "Any of it." That still wasn't an answer. I almost laughed, but it would have sounded too bitter. "It's funny," I said. "For weeks in the hospital, you screamed that I couldn't remember anything due to the drugs, that my memory was flawed." He tightened his jaw. "I was terrified, Helen." "Of what? Of me dying?" "Of losing the shop. Of the bankruptcy. Of losing everything I built. And losing me?" He fell entirely silent. And in that silence, he finally gave me the truest answer I was ever going to get. "Are you really going to execute 18 years of marriage over one single second of panic?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. I looked at the man who had brought me soup when I was sick, who had held me when my father died, and who had stood over my bed calculating the exact monetary value of my last breath. "No, Mark, I'm not. You executed 18 years of marriage in that second. I just survived it." He looked away, staring out the window. I wasn't thinking. "That's exactly the problem. You were thinking harder than you ever have in your entire life. You just stopped thinking of me as a human being." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw my coffee in his face. I stood up, put a $5 bill on the table for my drink, and walked out the door. He didn't follow me. Outside, the Michigan air was crisp and biting. The sky was that pale, overcast gray that I used to find so depressing. Today, it felt incredibly clean. I took a deep, full breath. My lungs didn't catch. They expanded perfectly. A few weeks later, I returned to that exact same coffee shop. Not for a dramatic confrontation, just to sit. I ordered a dark roast, sat by the window, and watched the Woodward Avenue traffic roll by. People walking dogs, businessmen carrying briefcases. It was painfully mundane. A year ago, I would have been bored. Today, it tasted exactly like freedom. Nobody was monitoring my questions. Nobody was snatching the mail out of my hands. Nobody was aggressively turning their phone screen away from me. I could sit there for 10 minutes, or I could sit there for 3 hours. I could drive back to Sarah's house, or I could walk through the park until my legs ached. They seem like tiny, insignificant choices. But it is precisely out of those tiny choices that you rebuild the absolute certainty that your life belongs to you alone. Before I left the cafe, I pulled a pen and a piece of stationery from my purse. I wrote a letter to the ICU administration at Detroit Receiving Hospital, asking them to forward it to Chloe. I didn't try to track her down on social media. I didn't want to make her the unwilling protagonist of my trauma. I only wrote 3 sentences. I do not remember much of my time in the dark, but I remember the voice that demanded I prove I was still there. "Thank you for not treating my silence as an absence, and for writing down the truth when I didn't have the breath to speak it myself." I signed it, sealed it, and dropped it in the mailbox on the corner. Sometimes, a simple "thank you" is exactly the right size. I returned to my job in payroll just after the new year. I started part-time, working 3 days a week. On my very first morning back, Rachel walked into my cubicle, set a fresh coffee on my desk, and smiled. Do you want me to dump all the office gossip on you right now? Or should I pace myself? She asked. Pace yourself, I laughed. And it was the first real laugh in a year that wasn't instantly followed by a shadow of guilt. In the aftermath of everything, I learned the hardest lesson of my life. Independence does not mean that you never need anyone. I desperately needed the doctors, the nurses, my sister, my cutthroat lawyer, and coworkers like Rachel who treated me like Helen, not like a fragile victim. True independence means something entirely different. It means that accepting help never requires you to surrender your voice. It means that love does not demand blind ignorance. It means that a marriage license is not a legal waiver to surrender your right to know exactly what risks are being taken with your future. It means that a human being lying paralyzed under a machine still holds intrinsic value, even if they cannot speak to defend it. That is the realization that stayed with me. Not the ventilator alarm, not the Chase bank statements, not Mark's cowardly tears. The finger. One tiny, exhausted movement of a finger across a cotton sheet. A movement that the entire world would have completely ignored, if not for one person who cared enough to ask the right question and wait for the answer. Sometimes I think that the entirety of our humanity is contained in moments exactly like that. Do we assume that just because someone is vulnerable, we have the right to strip away their agency? Do we mistake their silence for consent? When someone loses the physical strength to fight back, do we still see them as a person or just a problem to be solved? For me, the answer is permanent. The most defenseless people do not deserve less respect, they demand absolute protection. And trust, especially within a marriage, should never, ever require you to close your eyes to your own finances, your own liabilities, or your own safety. You can love someone completely and still demand to see the bank statements. You can trust someone deeply and still read the fine print before signing the contract. I thought I only got my voice back the day the doctors pulled the tube from my throat and I could finally speak. I was wrong. I got my voice back the exact second I decided to move my finger. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments below. Where do you think the line is drawn between trusting your partner and falling into dangerous, willful ignorance? Leave a like, share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and make sure you hit that subscribe button for more true stories about the boundaries, betrayals, and split-second decisions that can change a life forever.